He abandoned his pregnant wife 18 years ago to become a millionaire. And tonight he'll kneel in the rain begging forgiveness from their daughter after she discovers the truth in the worst possible way. Standing on his stage accepting his award, listening to him confess in front of cameras and witnesses that the keynote speaker who just delivered a devastating speech about abandonment is actually his daughter. The child he walked away from before she was born because John Wheeler chose a business deal in Singapore over the family waiting in a coastal apartment, chose potential wealth over present love, chose empire over the woman who believed in him, and the daughter who would inherit his eyes but not his name. Which is why Candy Miller Sr. went pale reading the gala invitation and seeing Wheeler Global Holdings because she knew this collision was coming, knew that her daughter who'd been selected from thousands of applicants to speak about rural education access and single mother resilience would walk into the ballroom built by her father's money, would accept an award funded by his guilt, would shake hands with the man whose absence shaped every day of her life. Except Candy Jr. doesn't know any of this, doesn't know that when she talks about people who abandon responsibility, then claim generosity, when she challenges philanthropists to ask if they're empowering the next generation or just funding programs to repair damage their absence caused, when she thanks her mother for teaching her that showing up is the real measure of success. She's describing John Wheeler perfectly. The billionaire sitting in the front row fighting tears because his daughter, brilliant, strong, everything he claims his foundation supports, is unknowingly prosecuting him for crimes he thought he'd buried under 18 years of success. And when the host calls him to present the award, John will make a choice that detonates everything. Grab the microphone, look at the daughter who has his emerald eyes and her mother's tilted smile and a spine built from surviving his absence, and confess that he's her father, that he left and never came back, that he built this empire instead of being a dad, turning the gala into a scandal that will either end with redemption or with his daughter running into the storm while he chases after her, both of them soaked and broken. Forced to answer the brutal question, can 18 years of abandonment be forgiven if the person finally shows up, or is some damage simply permanent? Hey, my amazing family, I love you endlessly. You give me hope and reason to smile. May the doors of heaven open wide over your life. May love greet you each morning and peace cover you every night. You are loved, favored, and never alone. Thank you for standing with me. Let's rise together. Drop a comment where you're watching from. Across the city, in a modest coastal apartment where salt air drifted through windows that overlooked a pier instead of a skyline, Candy Miller smoothed the emerald fabric of her daughter's gown with hands that had worked 3 jobs to afford this moment. Waitress, night clerk, seamstress, hands that had built a life from the ruins of a love that promised forever and delivered abandonment. She was 39 now, still beautiful in the way that suffering makes some women beautiful, resilience carved into the lines around her eyes, strength evident in the straightness of her spine, despite 18 years of carrying weight no one should bear alone. Her daughter, Candy Jr., 18, brilliant, burning with the kind of confidence that comes from being raised by a mother who turned survival into an art form, stood radiant in emerald silk, unaware that the Global Youth Empowerment Gala she was about to address was hosted by Wheeler Global Holdings, unaware that the empire sponsoring her speech was built on the bones of her mother's broken heart, unaware that the man who would present her award was the father who chose an ambition over her before she'd drawn her first breath. Tonight, John would rehearse a speech about empowering the next generation while his own daughter prepared words about resilience that would unknowingly indict every choice he'd made. Tonight, Candy Sr. would fasten a necklace around her daughter's throat with hands that wanted to protect her from a truth 18 years in the hiding. Tonight, Candy Jr. would step into spotlights powered by her father's money, stand on a stage built by his ambition, and speak about the strength of single mothers to a man who made her mother need that strength. Neither father nor daughter knew the universe had conspired to draw them together. Not through love or intention, but through the cruel poetry of fate that understood some reunions couldn't be gentle, some truths couldn't arrive quietly, some abandonments demanded public reckoning in ballrooms full of witnesses and cameras that would ensure forgiveness or destruction would be immortalized for the world to judge. The hook was layered like sediment, a powerful man haunted by the ghost of a single choice, a mother who'd rebuilt life from ashes and now watched her daughter walk toward the fire, a daughter stepping unknowingly into the past that created her, and a night that would force them all to confront whether 18 years of silence could be shattered by truth or would simply splinter into more carefully constructed lies. As the city prepared for the gala, limousines being polished, champagne being chilled, speeches being memorized, destiny began to stir. Not quietly or beautifully, but with the inevitability of storms that had been gathering for nearly 2 decades, waiting for the perfect moment to break. And tonight, beneath chandeliers that cost more than the apartment where his daughter was raised, John Wheeler would discover that the most expensive thing he'd ever paid for wasn't his empire. It was the 18 years he'd spent building it while his daughter grew up believing her father's absence meant she wasn't worth staying for. The invitation had arrived 3 weeks earlier, official letterhead embossed with the Wheeler Global Holdings logo that Candy Jr. had researched with the thoroughness of someone who treated every opportunity like the miracle it was. Global Youth Empowerment Gala, the invitation read. Keynote address, Emerging Leaders in Rural Education Reform. Her application, submitted on a whim, written at 2 a.m. between shifts at the community center where she volunteered teaching coding to kids whose families couldn't afford computers, had been selected from thousands. The honor came with a cash prize that would fund her nonprofit for a year. The opportunity meant speaking to philanthropists, investors, CEOs who could transform her small coastal education initiative into something that mattered beyond their town. She'd accepted immediately, not knowing her mother would go pale reading the sponsor's name, not understanding why Candy Sr. had locked herself in the bathroom for 20 minutes, not hearing the sobs her mother muffled with a towel pressed against her mouth. Because Candy Miller, Candy Sr., though she'd stopped thinking of herself that way after her daughter was born and needed a mother more than a girl with a broken heart needed a name, knew exactly who John Wheeler was. She'd known him when he was 23 and hungry, when ambition burned in his eyes like fever, when he'd promised her forever in a courthouse ceremony that cost $12 and felt like the beginning of everything. She'd known him the morning he'd kissed her growing belly, whispered promises to their unborn daughter, and walked out with a leather briefcase that held contracts that would make him rich and a heart that apparently couldn't hold both empire and family. The note he'd left said, "I'll come back when I'm worthy of you, when I can give our daughter everything." I promise. He never came back. And now, 18 years later, that same man, wealthy beyond measure, worthy by every metric capitalism recognized, was hosting a gala where their daughter would stand on his stage, speak into his microphones, accept his award, and have no idea the philanthropist presenting her trophy was the father who'd decided she wasn't reason enough to stay. At Wheeler Global's penthouse office, where floor-to-ceiling windows turned the city into a landscape of conquest and glass towers reflected empire back at itself, John Wheeler reviewed the evening's program with Leonard Morris, his assistant of 15 years. The closest thing John had to a friend, though neither would use that word because men like John didn't have friends. They had strategic relationships and people on payroll who knew when to speak and when silence served better. The keynote speaker, Leonard said, sliding a portfolio across the mahogany desk that had cost more than most people's cars. Remarkable young woman, Candy Miller. Her work in rural education access is genuinely innovative. She's built a network of learning hubs using recycled technology and volunteer teachers. The board thought she'd be perfect for our youth empowerment message. John glanced at the name without really seeing it. Candy Miller. Common enough. The world was full of candies. But then he opened the portfolio and saw the birth date, April 19th, 18 years ago, the same date he'd circled in his calendar for weeks. The date the baby was due. The date he'd been too terrified and ambitious to witness because he'd been in Singapore signing the deal that would become the foundation of his empire. His hands stilled on the paper. The calculation happened automatically. 18 years, 9 months before that would be July. The month he'd left. The month he'd walked away from a pregnant wife with promises that felt true when he made them, and turned to ash the moment he realized staying meant risking everything he wanted to become. "Sir," Leonard's voice came from far away. "Are you all right?" John flipped to the photograph. Emerald eyes that could have been his mother's. A smile that tilted slightly left, asymmetric and genuine, exactly like Candy used to smile before he broke that in her. Dark hair that fell in waves he recognized from his own reflection. A face that held determination and hope, and the kind of fierce intelligence that came from fighting for everything instead of inheriting anything. Where? John's voice cracked. He cleared his throat. Tried again. Where is she from? Coastal town, Port Elizabeth. She lists her mother as her primary contact. Candace Miller, single parent, works multiple jobs too. Get out, Leonard blinked. Sir? Get out, now, close the door. When he was alone, John pulled up the full background file the vetting team had compiled. Standard procedure for anyone invited to high-profile events. Mother, Candace, Candy Miller, age 39, employed at 3 part-time positions, no significant assets, renting the same apartment for 15 years. Father, unlisted. Relationship status, single. Emergency contact, daughter. Father, unlisted, because he'd never given her permission to use his name. Because he'd sent money once, a check for $10,000 about 6 months after he left, and it had been returned unopened with the note written in Candy's handwriting. We don't need your guilt. We needed you. He'd told himself she was being proud, stubborn, that she'd regret refusing help she clearly needed. He'd told himself he was respecting her wishes by not trying again. He told himself 1,000 lies that let him sleep at night while building towers that scraped clouds. And now, 18 years later, his daughter, the baby he'd abandoned, the child he'd convinced himself was better off without a father too broken to provide anything but money, was coming to his gala, would stand on his stage, would speak words he wasn't prepared to hear. John pressed his forehead against the cool window glass and looked down at the city he'd conquered. Somewhere in those streets, in an apartment he could find with a single phone call, but hadn't bothered to locate in 18 years, his daughter was preparing to meet him, and she had absolutely no idea who he was. That evening, as Candy Sr. helped her daughter into the emerald gown they'd spent 2 months saving for, buying fabric on sale, sewing it themselves because alterations cost too much, turning limitation into creation, the way they'd learned to turn everything into something better than it should have been. She felt the past rising like floodwater. Mom, Candy Darn said, catching her mother's expression in the mirror. You okay? You look like you've seen a ghost. Just proud, Candy Sr. managed, forcing brightness she didn't feel. My baby girl, speaking at the biggest gala in the state. Wheeler Global Holdings. Candy Jr. said the name with reverence, unaware it made her mother flinch. Can you imagine if this goes well, I could get funding for learning hubs in 5 more towns. We could help thousands of kids who... Be careful, Candy Sr. interrupted, then caught herself at her daughter's confused look. I mean, these people, sweetie, rich people, they're not like us. They make promises they don't keep. Mom, Candy Jr. turned, took her mother's hands. Whatever happened before, whatever made you so scared of people with money, it's not going to happen to me. You raised me too strong for that. You raised me to face the world, not hide from it. The words were meant to comfort, but landed like accusations, because Candy Sr. had been hiding for 18 years, hiding from the name Wheeler, hiding from the truth about her daughter's father, hiding behind the story that he was just a mistake, just a man who left, just someone not worth discussing because discussing him gave him power he didn't deserve. But now the hiding was over. Because in 3 hours they would walk into John Wheeler's ballroom, and Candy Sr. would see the man who'd destroyed her, rebuilt from her ashes into something successful and celebrated while she'd scrubbed floors and worked night shifts and sacrificed everything so their daughter could become exactly the kind of person John claimed to admire. Resilient, principled, strong. And the cruelest part, Candy Jr. would thank him, would accept his award, would shake his hand and have no idea she was touching the man whose absence had shaped every day of her life. Finish getting ready, Candy Sr. said quietly. I need a moment. In the bathroom, she stared at her reflection and saw the girl she'd been, 21, pregnant, terrified, holding a note that promised he'd return. She'd believed him, had waited, had defended him to her parents who said he'd abandoned her, had insisted he was just scared, just needed time, just had to secure their future. The note was still in her jewelry box, yellowed, creased from being folded and unfolded in the early days when she still thought he might mean it. Tonight she'd see if he even recognized her, if guilt had carved lines in his face the way loneliness had carved them in hers. If he'd spent 18 years thinking about the daughter he abandoned, or if she'd been easy to forget once ambition offered better company. Outside, car horns honked. The gala would start in 2 hours. Destiny was about to force a reunion, 18 years in the avoiding. And Candy Sr. didn't know if she wanted forgiveness or just the satisfaction of watching him realize exactly what and who he'd lost. The portfolio landed on John Wheeler's desk with the soft weight of consequences disguised as paperwork. "Our youngest keynote speaker," Leonard Morris said, adjusting his glasses with the precise efficiency of a man who'd spent 15 years learning to read his employer's moods before they fully formed. Remarkable girl, Candy Miller. The board was unanimous. Her rural education work is exactly the kind of grassroots innovation we want associated with the Wheeler global brand. John glanced at the name without really seeing it, mind still half occupied with the Singapore merger that had consumed his morning. Candy Miller. Common enough the world was full of Candies, full of Millers, full of coincidences that meant nothing. "Background vetted?" he asked automatically, reaching for the file with the casual interest of someone who'd reviewed hundreds of grant applications and keynote proposals, for whom young people with big dreams had become a category rather than individuals. "Thoroughly, she's extraordinary. Built a network of learning hubs using donated technology and volunteer teachers. Brings coding classes, literacy programs, career counseling to communities that can't afford them." Leonard's voice carried genuine admiration. "Started it at 16 with money from a part-time job. The girl's been working since she was 14. "Good." John opened the portfolio, eyes scanning the executive summary with the speed of someone trained to extract relevant data and discard everything else. Awards, recognition, impact metrics that looked impressive for someone so young. He flipped to the biographical section, looking for the usual markers: prestigious schools, connected parents, the invisible advantages that usually explained early success. His hands stilled on the page. Birth date, April 19th. April 19th. The numbers swam before his eyes, rearranging themselves into a calculation his mind performed against his will. 18 years ago. 6 months after he'd left Candy, his Candy, the one who'd loved him when he was nobody, who'd married him in a courthouse with $12 vows and infinite hope. 6 months after he'd walked out promising to return when he was worthy. 6 months would have been when the baby was born. The baby he'd never met, never seen, never held. The due date had been mid-April. He remembered because he'd circled it in his calendar in Singapore, had felt guilt twist in his gut while signing contracts that would make him rich, had told himself he'd send money, would make it right, would return once he'd built something worthy of the woman who'd believed in him. "Sir?" Leonard's voice came from somewhere far away. "Everything all right?" John's throat had gone dry. He forced his eyes to continue down the page, looking for the detail that would prove this was coincidence, that the world wasn't cruel enough to engineer this particular collision. Mother, Candace Miller, age 39, single parent, current residence, Port Elizabeth. Port Elizabeth, the coastal town where he'd left her, where they'd lived in that tiny apartment that smelled like salt air and dreams too big for the space they occupied. Candace, Candy, his Candy. "The photo," John managed, voice rough. "Where's her photo?" Leonard leaned forward, flipping to the next page. "Right here, professional headshot from last year's Regional Education Summit." John's world narrowed to the glossy photograph staring up at him from expensive paper stock. Emerald eyes that could have been his mother's, the same shade, the same intensity, the kind of green that held light and threw it back, transformed. Dark hair that fell in waves he recognized from his own reflection every morning, from the genetics he'd inherited from a father he'd barely known. A smile that tilted slightly left, asymmetric and genuine, exactly like Candy used to smile before he broke something in her that smiles required. But it was the confidence that destroyed him. The way this girl looked at the camera with the self-possession of someone who'd fought for everything she had, who'd learned early that the world wouldn't hand her anything, who carried herself with a strength that came from surviving rather than inheriting. She had his eyes and her mother's smile and a spine built from 18 years of his absence. "Sir?" Leonard's concern had sharpened into alarm. "You look pale. Should I call?" "Get out." "I'm sorry?" "Get out." John's voice came out strangled, barely controlled. "Now, close the door. Cancel my afternoon. I don't want to be disturbed." Leonard gathered his tablet with the efficient silence of someone who knew when to obey without question. The door clicked shut, and John was alone with the photograph of a daughter he'd abandoned before she was born. His hand trembled as he pulled up the full background report, the detailed vetting file the security team compiled for anyone invited to high-profile events. The information loaded in clinical bullet points that felt like accusations. Candace Miller, 3 part-time positions, breakfast waitress, night clerk, weekend seamstress, renting same 2-bedroom apartment for 15 years, no vehicle, public transportation, no significant assets, no college degree, emergency contact, daughter, Candy Miller Jr., honor student, dual enrollment community college, 4 scholarships, works part-time at community center, volunteers 20 hours weekly, founded nonprofit at age 16, no disciplinary record, no father listed on birth certificate, no father listed, because he'd never given her permission to use his name, because he'd sent one check, $10,000, 6 months after the baby was born, when guilt finally outweighed fear, and Candy had returned it with a note. "We don't need your guilt. We needed you." He'd told himself she was being proud, stubborn, that she'd regret refusing help when she realized how hard single motherhood would be. He'd told himself he was respecting her wishes by not trying again. He'd told himself lies that let him sleep in penthouse suites while his daughter grew up in a 2-bedroom apartment her mother could barely afford. John pushed back from his desk, legs unsteady, crossed to the floor-to-ceiling windows that turned the city into a landscape of conquest. 41 stories below, people moved like blood cells through streets he'd helped shape with investments and developments, through an economy where his name carried weight that could move markets. But somewhere in those streets, in an apartment he could locate with a single phone call, but hadn't bothered to in 18 years, his daughter was preparing to meet him, and she had absolutely no idea who he was. "If she's mine," John whispered to the glass, to the city, to the reflection that looked like success and felt like failure. "If she's mine, I've already failed her." The words hung in the empty office, truth no amount of wealth could refute, because he hadn't just failed her once by leaving. He'd failed her every day for 18 years. Every birthday he missed, every school play he didn't attend, every night she went to bed without a father because he'd decided she wasn't reason enough to stay. He'd built an empire while she'd built herself. He'd accumulated billions while she'd learned to survive on whatever her mother could cobble together from multiple jobs. He'd been celebrated as a visionary while the daughter who inherited his intelligence had to fight for every opportunity he'd taken for granted once money made everything easy. Thunder rumbled in the distance, early storm rolling in from the coast, dark clouds gathering over the skyline like judgment. John pressed his forehead against the cool glass and watched lightning fork through the sky, illuminating the city in brief flashes that made everything look both more beautiful and more fragile than it actually was. In 3 hours, she'd walk through the doors of his ballroom. In 4 hours, she'd step onto his stage. In 5 hours, she'd stand in his spotlight, accepting his award, and he'd have to decide. Stay silent and let her leave, never knowing, or shatter the careful lies he'd built around his guilt and tell her the truth. That the philanthropist celebrating her resilience was the man whose absence made that resilience necessary. That the empire hosting her was built on the foundation of abandoning her. That sometimes the richest men are the poorest fathers. Outside, thunder cracked louder, closer. Inside, regret pressed against his ribs like broken glass. Two storms, one gathering in the sky, one breaking in his chest, both moving toward the same inevitable collision. And John Wheeler, who'd spent 18 years convincing himself that leaving was the kindest thing he could have done, finally understood what Candy had tried to tell him in that return check. His daughter didn't need his guilt or his money or his perfectly rehearsed apologies. She'd needed him, and he'd chosen everything else instead. The emerald dress hung on the back of Candy Senior's bedroom door like a promise. Beautiful, expensive by their standards, sewn with hands that had learned to create beauty from limitation. 2 months of saving, fabric purchased on sale, alterations done at midnight after shifts ended. Every stitch a prayer that this opportunity would change her daughter's life the way her own life had been changed 18 years ago, though in the opposite direction. Not destruction, but elevation. Not abandonment, but arrival. Candy Sr. knelt on the worn carpet, pinning the final hem with hands that trembled slightly despite decades of steady work. Her daughter stood patient on the step stool they'd borrowed from their neighbor, scrolling through her speech notes on a phone with a cracked screen that still worked fine if you didn't mind the spider web across the corner. "Remember, baby?" Candy Sr. said, voice soft with the weight of lessons learned in suffering. "Confidence is quieter than pride. These people, the ones who will be at the gala, they're used to loud. Be the quiet that makes them listen." "I know, Mom." Candy Jr.'s voice carried affection and mild exasperation in equal measure, the tone of a daughter who'd heard this particular wisdom many times. "You've told me since I was 6. Quiet confidence beats loud arrogance every time." "Because it's true." Candy Sr. secured another pin, measuring the hem with eyes that had learned precision from necessity. "When you walk into that room tonight, half those people will assume you don't belong. They'll look at your dress and know it's not designer. They'll hear your accent and place you somewhere coastal, somewhere small, somewhere that doesn't matter to people who measure worth in square footage and stock portfolios. Mom, let them underestimate you, then speak and show them that brilliance doesn't require a trust fund." She sat back on her heels, studying the hem with satisfaction. "Perfect. You'll be perfect." Candy Jr. stepped down carefully, crossing to the mirror to examine herself. The emerald fabric caught light and threw it back transformed, making her look older, more sophisticated, like someone who belonged in ballrooms with people whose monthly clothing budget exceeded their annual rent. "I still can't believe I got selected," she said, a voice hushed with wonder. "Out of thousands of applicants. The prize money alone will fund the learning hubs for a year. But the connections, Mom, the people who will be there." She turned, eyes bright with possibility. "This could change everything." Candy Sr. smiled, reaching for the invitation on the dresser to check the time. But when her eyes landed on the embossed logo at the top of the card, the smile froze. Wheeler Global Holdings. The name hit like a fist to the solar plexus. The room tilted. Her pulse spiked, hammering against her ribs with the force of panic barely contained. Wheeler, John Wheeler, no, it couldn't be. Wheeler was a common enough name. The world was full of Wheelers. This was coincidence. It had to be coincidence because the universe wasn't cruel enough to engineer this particular collision after 18 years of careful avoidance. But her hands shook as she pulled up the gala website on her phone, scrolling with fingers that felt numb. There, on the About page, a photograph that made time collapse. John Wheeler, founder and CEO, standing in front of glass towers that literally reflected his empire back at him. Older now, sharper, hair touched with gray at the temples that made him look distinguished instead of aged. Wearing a suit that cost more than 3 months of her combined salaries, but unmistakably him. The same steel gray eyes that had once looked at her like she was the only thing worth seeing. The same jawline she traced with her fingers in the tiny apartment where they'd promised each other forever. The same mouth that had kissed her pregnant belly and whispered promises to their unborn daughter before walking out the door. The phone slipped from her nerveless fingers, hitting the carpet with a muffled thud. "Mom?" Candy Jr.'s voice came from far away, concerned. "What's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." Ghost, yes, that's exactly what she'd seen. The ghost of a man who'd once loved her or claimed to before ambition revealed itself as the true object of his devotion. The memory crashed through her carefully constructed defenses. That morning 18 years ago, waking to an empty bed, finding the note on the kitchen table beside the coffee mug he'd used the night before. Her hands had shaken, reading his handwriting. Neat, precise, the penmanship of someone who'd practiced looking professional even when delivering devastation. Candy, I can't do this the way we planned. The deal in Singapore, it's everything we talked about, everything I need to become to give you and our baby the life you deserve. But they won't wait. If I don't go now, we lose it all. I'm taking the red eye. I'll be back when I'm worthy of you, when I can give our daughter everything. I promise, I love you. I'm doing this for us. John, she had read it 3 times before the words arranged themselves into meaning. He was gone. Not temporarily, not for a weekend business trip. Gone in the way that men leave when they've decided the future they promised is harder than the future they can have without you. Her chest had tightened then the same way it tightened now, airless, pressurized, on the edge of collapse. Mom! Candy Jr. was kneeling beside her, hands gripping her shoulders. Talk to me. What's happening? Candy Sr. forced breath into lungs that had forgotten how to expand. The gala, she managed. The sponsor. Wheeler Global Holdings. Yeah, they're the host. It's incredible that... We can't go. Silence. Candy Jr. pulled back, confusion clouding her face. What? We can't go to the gala. You can't... Candy Sr. stood abruptly, pacing the small bedroom like an animal searching for escape. We need to decline. Tell them you're sick. Tell them anything. But you can't go. Mom, this is the biggest opportunity of my life. The prize money, the connections. I don't care. The words came out harsh, desperate. Find another opportunity. There will be others. But this one, this place, these people. She couldn't say his name, couldn't force the syllables past lips that had spent 18 years refusing to speak it. Candy Jr. stood slowly, studying her mother with the careful attention of someone trying to solve a puzzle that didn't make sense. What aren't you telling me? Everything. The truth about her father, the man who'd left before she was born. The abandonment Candy Sr. had softened over the years into a story about someone who wasn't ready instead of someone who'd made a choice, who'd picked ambition over love, who'd promised to return and never did. The man hosting this gala, Candy Sr. said carefully, voice shaking. I knew him a long time ago, before you were born, and seeing him again, I just can't. Understanding dawned slowly across her daughter's face. This is about my father. It wasn't a question. Candy Sr. had never explicitly confirmed or denied the few times her daughter had asked, had always deflected with vague statements about someone who left, and it doesn't matter who he was, only who we are. But her silence now was confirmation enough. The man hosting this gala is my father. Candy Jr.'s voice had gone flat, emotionless, in the way that meant too many emotions were fighting for dominance. John Wheeler, the billionaire philanthropist. That's who you're afraid of seeing. I'm not afraid, but the lie died before it finished forming because they both knew better. Fear was exactly what had Candy Sr.'s pulse racing and hands shaking and breath coming short. Candy Jr. crossed the room, took her mother's trembling hands in her own steady ones. You always told me to face my fears. You always said that running from hard things only makes them chase you harder. Her voice was gentle but firm, the tone of a daughter who'd learned strength from a mother who'd had no choice but to be strong. Isn't it time we both did? Face the fear instead of letting it keep us small. This is different. How? Because, Candy Sr.'s voice cracked, because if he sees you, baby, everything will collapse. The life we've built, the story I told you about why he left. The careful distance I've maintained. If he sees you, if he realizes that I'm his daughter, Candy Jr. finished. Good. Let him see what he walked away from. Let him understand exactly what his worthy ambition cost him. You don't understand what you're asking. I understand that I've spent 18 years being half a person because you were afraid to let me know where the other half came from. Anger bled through the gentleness now, sharp and justified. I understand that you've protected his secret all this time, that you let me grow up thinking maybe I wasn't worth staying for, when the truth is he just wasn't man enough to try. The words hung between them, accusations wrapped in truth. This isn't about him, Candy Jr. continued. This is about me, my work, my opportunity, my chance to stand in front of people who can fund learning hubs in 10 more towns and tell them why education access matters. She squeezed her mother's hands. I'm going to that gala, Mom, with or without you, but I'd really prefer with. Outside, the sea wind picked up, howling through the narrow streets of the coastal town that had been their sanctuary for 18 years. It carried the scent of salt and rain and memory, rattling windows and bending trees, nature's way of reminding them that some forces couldn't be controlled or predicted or avoided. You could only decide whether to hide from the storm or walk into it. Candy Sr. looked at her daughter, brilliant, brave, beautiful in ways that had nothing to do with the emerald dress, and saw the truth she'd been avoiding. This moment had always been coming. Fate or coincidence, or the universe's cruel sense of poetry had arranged this collision, and no amount of maternal fear could prevent it. Okay, she whispered. We'll go, but Candy, baby, when you see him, when he presents that award, you say, you need to know that whatever he says, whatever he claims to feel, I know, Candy Jr. said softly. He left. Actions speak louder than words. You taught me that. She pulled her mother into a hug that felt like protection and promised both. I've got this, Mom. We've got this. But as Candy Sr. held her daughter, breathing in the lavender shampoo she'd used since middle school, listening to the wind howl outside like memory itself, she couldn't shake the certainty that they were about to walk into something neither of them was prepared for. Because 18 years of silence was about to shatter in a ballroom full of witnesses, and once truth was spoken in spotlights, there was no taking it back. The gleaming hallways of Wheeler Global Holdings stretched like corridors in a cathedral built to worship success, marble floors polished to mirrors, walls lined with awards and photographs documenting John's rise from nobody to titan, floor-to-ceiling windows offering views of a city he'd helped shape with investments that moved markets and developments that redefined skylines. John walked these halls every morning, nodded at employees who treated him with the deference reserved for men whose signatures could change lives, stood in elevators where conversations died when he entered because power created silence more effectively than any request for quiet. He was admired by all, understood by none, because how could they understand? The junior analysts for crunching numbers didn't know that every million he made felt hollow. The executives plotting expansion strategies didn't know that success tasted like ash when you traded everything that mattered to acquire it. The board members praising his vision didn't know that vision required blindness to things like love and loyalty, and the woman who'd believed in him before the world learned his name. Every headline praised his business genius. Wheeler disrupts industry. Philanthropist of the year. The man who built an empire on innovation. But none mentioned the cost. None mentioned Candy. Leonard found him in the conference room at noon, staring at the skyline instead of the quarterly reports spread across the table like evidence of success John couldn't feel. Sir, Leonard's voice carried hesitation, which meant bad news or complicated news or news that would require decisions John didn't want to make. The additional background on the keynote speaker. You asked for confirmation. John's chest tightened. Part of him had hoped the morning's discovery was error. Wrong birth date, different Candace Miller. Coincidence instead of consequence. But Leonard's expression told him hope was wasted. Show me. Leonard slid his tablet across the polished wood. The screen displayed a photograph John had already seen. Candy Jr. at a youth rally, speaking into a microphone with the confidence of someone who'd earned the right to be heard, but now accompanied by detailed biographical information that read like accusation. Mother Candace Elena Miller, maiden name Candace Reeves, age 39. Married John David Wheeler, age 23 on July 12, 2007 in civil ceremony. Marriage dissolved by abandonment. Divorce finalized 2009. No child support requested or received. Current employment, 3 part-time positions totaling 65 hours weekly. No college degree, attended 2 semesters before pregnancy, withdrew due to financial hardship. Resides Port Elizabeth, same address since 2010. The words marriage dissolved by abandonment felt like a sentence passed on him 18 years too late. Daughter Candace Marie Miller, born April 19, 2008. Father unknown, birth certificate list mother only, no paternity established. Academic record, exceptional. 4 scholarships earned. Founded Learning Hubs Initiative at age 16. Currently dual-enrolled community college while completing high school. Works part-time at community center. Volunteers 20-plus hours weekly. Awards, Regional Youth Innovator 2024. Education Access Advocate 2025. Future Leader Recognition 2025. Father unknown, as if he were dead instead of simply absent, as if 18 years of cowardice could erase biology. Leonard cleared his throat gently. She has your eyes, he said, voice soft with something that might have been pity or judgment or both. The shape of her face, the way she tilts her head when she's thinking. I pulled video footage from last month's education summit. Sir, she's unmistakably yours. John sank into his leather chair, Italian leather, custom built, cost more than the car he had been driving when he left Candy, and felt the weight of fatherhood he'd never claimed settling on shoulders that had carried billion-dollar decisions, but apparently couldn't bear the responsibility of a child. Dismissed, he managed. Sir, leave now, please. When the door clicked shut, John pulled the tablet closer, scrolling through photographs that documented a life he'd missed entirely. Candy Jr. at 12, gap-toothed smile receiving an award for a science project. At 14, serious and focused, teaching coding to younger kids at a community center. At 16, holding a banner that read, Education is Freedom, at the launch event for her nonprofit. Every photograph was a mirror reflecting his failure. Every accomplishment was evidence that she'd thrived without him, not because of his absence, but despite it. Her mother had given her everything John's money should have provided: opportunity, confidence, purpose. Everything except a father. He pressed a trembling hand to his temple where a headache had been building since morning. The truth was a mirror, and he no longer liked the man reflected in it. That man had chosen ambition over love, had convinced himself that leaving was noble, that returning rich would somehow justify the abandonment, had built towers of steel and glass to prove his worth to a woman who'd never asked him to prove anything except that he'd stay. His phone buzzed when Veronica's name appeared on the screen. Dinner tonight? Need to finalize wedding details. Wedding? Right. He was engaged to Veronica Hale, elegant, connected, perfect in every way that mattered to people who measured compatibility in social capital and strategic alliance. She understood his world, spoke his language, never asked questions about his past because people like Veronica understood that everyone had histories better left unexamined. But looking at his daughter's photographs, John felt the engagement ring in his pocket like a weight he couldn't carry. How could he marry Veronica when he'd never properly mourned the family he'd destroyed? How could he promise forever to someone new when he'd broken forever with someone who'd actually deserved it? He pulled a leather journal from his desk drawer, the kind executives use for strategic planning and important notes, and opened to a blank page. His hand shook as he wrote, Dear Candy Jr., I don't know if I'll ever give you this letter. I don't know if I'll ever have the courage to speak these words aloud, but I need to write them, even if only to prove to myself that I understand the magnitude of what I've done. I'm your father. I don't deserve that title. I didn't earn it. But biology doesn't care about deserve or earn. It just is. And the biological fact is that I'm the reason you exist, and I'm also the reason you grew up without a father. I left when your mother was 6 months pregnant with you. I told myself I was leaving to build a better life for us. The truth is, I was terrified of being poor, of failing, of becoming my own father, broke and bitter and defeated. So I chose the deal in Singapore over the family in Port Elizabeth. I chose potential wealth over present love. I chose my fear over your future. And then I never came back. The pen stopped. John stared at words that felt both true and insufficient. How could language capture 18 years of absence? How could apology address the birthdays he'd missed, the first words he'd never heard, the moments of triumph and fear when a daughter needed a father and found only empty space where he should have been. He continued writing, knowing the words were inadequate but needing to document the truth before courage failed. Your mother sent back the money I tried to send. She was right to. You didn't need my guilt wrapped in a check. You needed me, and I wasn't brave enough to be what you needed. Tonight, I'll watch you speak at a gala funded by the empire I built instead of being your father. I'll present you an award for achievements you earned without my name or help or presence. And I'll have to decide whether to tell you the truth or let you leave, never knowing that the philanthropist celebrating you is the man who abandoned you. I don't know which would be crueler. If I could go back, if I could stand in that apartment again, 23 years old, holding your mother and feeling you kick against my palm, I'd choose differently. I'd choose you. I'd choose love over ambition. I'd choose the terrifying beauty of being a father over the hollow victory of being a success. But I can't go back. All I can do is stand here at 41, looking at photographs of the daughter I don't know, and understand that the biggest failure of my life wasn't the deals that fell through or the investments that lost money. It was walking away from you. I'm sorry, those words aren't enough. They'll never be enough. But they're all I have. I'm sorry I wasn't brave enough to stay. I'm sorry I let fear win. I'm sorry you grew up thinking you weren't worth fighting for. You were, you are, you always will be. I just wasn't strong enough to see it until 18 years too late. John. He set the pen down, hand is shaking harder now. Outside, the city continued its indifferent rhythm, traffic flowing, construction rising, commerce humming with the efficiency of capitalism that rewarded men like him for being ruthless and punished them not at all for being cowards. Thunder rumbled in the distance. Storm clouds gathered over the skyline, dark and heavy with rain that would wash the city clean while leaving the guilt intact. John folded the letter carefully, tucked it into his jacket pocket where it rested against his heart like a confession he might never make aloud. Then he stood, straightened his tie, and looked at his reflection in the window glass. The man looking back was successful by every metric that mattered to the world. But the world didn't know what John knew, that success built on abandonment was just ambition, dressed in expensive suits. That empires constructed while ignoring the people who needed you most were towers without foundation, destined to collapse the moment truth demanded accounting. Tonight, his past would walk through the doors of his present, his daughter would stand in his spotlight, and John would have to decide, continue the lie that his life was triumph, or admit that he'd won everything except what mattered. The thunder cracked louder. The storm was coming. And John Wheeler, who'd spent 18 years running from the wreckage of his choices, finally understood there was nowhere left to run. The truth was waiting in an emerald dress with his eyes and her mother's smile. And tonight it would demand he answer for every year he'd chosen to stay away. The ballroom glowed like captured starlight, amber and gold, chandeliers scattering brilliance across marble floors that reflected wealth back at itself in endless mirrors. Crystal glassware caught light and through it transformed. Silk gowns whispered secrets as they moved. The air itself felt expensive, perfumed with roses that cost more per arrangement than most people spent on weekly groceries, thick with the particular atmosphere of rooms where power gathered to perform charity while calculating tax deductions. This was the world John Wheeler had built, not just the ballroom, though Wheeler Global had donated the funds for this venue's restoration, but the entire ecosystem of wealth and influence that filled it. Every CEO shaking hands, every investor comparing portfolios, every philanthropist whose giving was measured in headlines rather than impact. This was his tribe, his language, his carefully constructed kingdom. And walking into it, feeling the weight of borrowed elegance in an emerald dress that had taken 2 months to afford, Candy Jr. felt like an astronaut stepping onto an alien planet where the gravity was different and the air was thin and every breath required conscious effort. Remember, her mother whispered, gripping her hand with barely concealed terror. You belong here. Your work earned this. Don't let them make you feel small. But Candy Jr. could feel her mother trembling. Not with cold, because the ballroom was warm, but with the kind of fear that came from walking into the territory of someone who'd hurt you and never faced consequences for it. Mom, she squeezed back. We can leave if this is too hard. No. Candy Sr. straightened her spine with visible effort, chin lifting in the gesture her daughter had inherited, the one that meant she'd decided to face the hard thing instead of running from it. We're here, you're going to give your speech, you're going to collect your award, and if he sees us, her voice caught, if he recognizes us, then he'll have to live with what he walked away from. They moved deeper into the ballroom, and Candy Jr. felt eyes tracking them, not hostile, but assessing, calculating. The look of people who measured worth in dress labels and jewelry value, and whatever invisible markers separated those who belonged from those who were guests of charity programs designed to make the wealthy feel magnanimous. Near the stage, John Wheeler stood in conversation with a woman who looked like she'd been sculpted by expensive cosmetic procedures and dressed by someone with an unlimited budget and no sense of color restraint. Red silk that screamed for attention, diamonds that caught every light source, hair swept into an elaborate updo that must have taken hours to achieve. She had her hand possessively on John's arm, leaning close to whisper something that made him nod absently, his attention clearly elsewhere. This, Candy Jr. realized with a jolt that felt like recognition without logic, was her father. The man her mother had loved, the man who'd left, the billionaire philanthropist whose empire was hosting the gala that would change her life. She'd imagined this moment, rehearsed it in her head during the sleepless nights when questions about her father kept her awake, despite her mother's insistence that some people aren't worth knowing. She'd imagined him shorter, harder, meaner. Imagine someone whose face would make his abandonment make sense. If he looked cruel, then leaving was just cruelty, which was at least comprehensible. But John Wheeler didn't look cruel. He looked tired, handsome still, in the way that money and good genes combined to create, but tired in a way that expensive suits couldn't hide. His steel gray eyes, the same shade as her own, she realized with a shock, held something that might have been regret or might have been the emptiness that came from owning everything except peace. You look pale, the woman beside him murmured, loud enough that Candy Jr. could hear despite the crowd noise. Nerves or nostalgia? Neither, John replied, but his voice lacked conviction. Just a long day. Candy Jr. forced herself to look away, to mingle, to accept champagne from servers who moved through the crowd like synchronized swimmers, to make small talk with donors who asked about her work with the careful politeness of people who were generous with money but suspicious of the recipients who needed it. But her attention kept drifting back to John, watching the way he moved through his element with practiced ease, the way people gravitated toward him like planets orbiting a sun, the way he commanded space without demanding it, the way power created its own gravity that pulled everything into its field. She tried to hate him, tried to summon the anger her mother had never spoken but clearly carried, the rage of abandonment, the wound of not being chosen. But all she felt was a complicated tangle of curiosity and resentment in something that might have been longing, the ache of wanting to know the man whose DNA she carried, but whose presence had been absent her entire life. And then, across the crowded ballroom, their eyes met. It lasted maybe 3 seconds, maybe less. But in that brief collision of gazes, something cracked inside John Wheeler, visible even from distance, a fissure in the careful composure he wore like armor. Recognition without logic, love without reason. The look of a man seeing a ghost and realizing the ghost was actually his living daughter, real and present and heartbreakingly beautiful, in a way that had nothing to do with the emerald dress and everything to do with the strength her absence had forced her to build. Who is she? The woman in red, Veronica, Candy Jr. would learn later, the fiancé who would become a collateral damage in the truth that was about to explode, followed John's gaze with sharpening suspicion. Why are you staring at that girl like you've seen a ghost? John's voice when he answered was barely audible, hollow, broken in a way that suggested 18 years of guilt choosing this moment to surface. Because she reminds me of everything I lost. The music swelled, orchestra hidden somewhere, strings weaving through conversations. The soundtrack to a night that was about to become watershed moment instead of charity event. Across the ballroom, Candy Sr. had gone rigid beside her daughter, face drained of color, staring at John with the look of someone watching a car accident unfold in slow motion. Inevitable, devastating, unable to look away. "Mom?" Candy Jr. touched her arm gently. "You okay?" But her mother couldn't answer, could only watch as the man who'd promised to return when he was worthy finally laid eyes on the woman he'd left and the daughter he'd never met. The clock above the stage read 7:42 p.m. In 18 minutes, Candy Jr. would take that stage to deliver a speech about resilience and education access and the strength of single mothers who built miracles from minimum wage. In 23 minutes, John Wheeler would present her an award for achievements earned without his name or help or presence. In 25 minutes, he would make a choice that would shatter his carefully constructed empire and force a reckoning 18 years in the avoiding. But right now, in this suspended moment before truth detonated, they were just three people in a ballroom full of strangers. A father who'd run, a mother who'd survived, and a daughter who'd been the reason for one and the result of the other. The music swelled, the lights dimmed, the host's voice crackled over speakers, announcing that dinner service would begin shortly and the program would commence at 8. Destiny tightened its grip, and somewhere between the champagne and the chandeliers, or between the emerald dress and the navy tuxedo, between 18 years of silence and the words that were about to break it, the universe held its breath, waiting. The spotlights fell like judgment. Candy Jr. stood in the wings, heart hammering, watching the host finish his introduction. Something about youth empowerment and grassroots innovation and the future belonging to those brave enough to build it. While her hands shook with nerves that had nothing to do with public speaking and everything to do with the man sitting at the front table, the one whose eyes hadn't left her since she'd walked through the ballroom doors 40 minutes earlier. And now, the host announced with practiced enthusiasm, please welcome our keynote speaker, founder of the Learning Hubs Initiative, advocate for rural education access, and this year's recipient of the Wheeler Global Youth Empowerment Award, Miss Candy Miller. Applause filled the ballroom, polite, measured, the kind of clapping that happened at charity events where supporting the cause was performative. Candy Jr. walked onto the stage on legs that felt unsteady, gripping her note cards like a lifeline, blinking against lights that turned the audience into a blur of expensive fabric and expectant faces. She found her mother in the crowd, third table from the front, sitting rigid with pride and terror warring across her face. And beside the stage, in the seat of honor reserved for the award presenter, John Wheeler sat perfectly still, hands clasped on the table in front of him, face carefully neutral except for his eyes, which held something that looked like devastation barely contained. Candy Jr. took a breath, the room quieted, and she began. Success, she said, voice steadier than expected, isn't measured by what we own, but by what we overcome. The words were ones she'd written weeks ago, rehearsed 100 times, but speaking them now in this room to this audience, with her father sitting 10 feet away, they felt different, heavier, true in a way that transcended the speech she'd planned. I grew up in a coastal town most of you have never heard of, Port Elizabeth, small, modest, the kind of place where ambition is viewed with suspicion because dreaming big feels like betraying the people who taught you to be grateful for small. She saw heads nodding, people who'd come from somewhere before they'd made it here, who remembered when gala invitations were fantasy instead of obligation. My mother worked 3 jobs to keep food on our table. Breakfast waitress at the diner on Harbor Street, the kind of place where coffee is 50 cents and the pancakes are the size of your head. Night clerk at the motel by the highway, where truckers and traveling salespeople paid cash and didn't ask questions. Weekend seamstress, hemming pants and repairing wedding dresses for people who couldn't afford the boutiques downtown. In his seat, John's hands tightened on the table. His face had gone pale. 3 jobs, 65 hours a week. She did that for 18 years, while getting her GED at night, while helping me with homework she didn't understand, while teaching me that strength isn't loud, it's quiet. It's the kind that holds you through nights when the world forgets your name. The ballroom had gone silent. No one was checking phones, no one was whispering, they were listening. I didn't understand then what I understand now, that my mother was showing me what success actually looks like. Not the numbers in your bank account, not the square footage of your house, not the label on your dress or the car in your driveway. Candy Jr. paused, letting the words breathe. Success is measuring up to your own reflection. It's looking at yourself at the end of the day and knowing you didn't compromise the things that matter. John couldn't breathe. Each word was a mirror reflecting every compromise he'd made, every principle he'd abandoned, every moment he'd chosen comfort over character. My mother taught me that some people will promise you the world and deliver only disappointment. That trust is earned, not given. That absence tells you more about someone's priorities than any words they speak. Her eyes found her mother in the audience. Candy Sr. was crying now, silent tears streaming down her face. And she taught me that you can build a beautiful life from broken pieces if you're willing to do the work no one else will do. The crowd began to applaud, not the polite clapping from before, but genuine, moved, the kind of response that happened when words landed true. But Candy Jr. wasn't finished. Tonight I'm receiving an award that comes with money to fund learning hubs in communities like mine. Places where kids deserve better than what geography and economics dealt them. Places where single mothers are building futures from minimum wage and determination. Places that people with power, she looked directly at John now, often forget to see. Because it's easier to fund education initiatives than to acknowledge why those initiatives are necessary. Easier to write checks than to ask why some communities need charity while others inherit opportunity. The applause had died. The mood had shifted. No longer comfortable celebration, but something sharper, more challenging. So I'm accepting this award, and I'm grateful. But I also want to challenge everyone here, especially those with the most power, the most resources, the most ability to create change, to ask yourselves, are we solving problems, or are we making ourselves feel better about creating them? Silence, thick and uncomfortable. Are we empowering the next generation, or are we abandoning them and then claiming generosity when we fund programs to repair the damage our absence caused? John's composure shattered visibly. His hands were shaking. His face had gone from pale to gray. I don't have the answers. I just have questions born from 18 years of watching my mother work herself exhausted, while the people who should have supported her, who promised to support her, chose other priorities. Candy Jr.'s voice cracked. So when you applaud tonight, applaud her. The single mother who built a daughter capable of standing on this stage. The woman who turned abandonment into ambition. The person who taught me that the real measure of success is showing up, especially when it's hard. Especially when it would be easier to walk away. The host was signaling from the wings. Time to wrap up, get to the award presentation, move the program along. But Candy Jr. had one more thing to say. Thank you for this honor. Thank you for seeing value in the work. And thank you to my mother, her voice broke completely, for seeing value in me when the world suggested I wasn't worth staying for. She stepped back from the microphone. The ballroom erupted. Applause thunderous now, people rising to their feet, moved by words that had transcended prepared speech and become something raw, honest, painful in its truth. The host returned to the stage, smiling with slightly forced enthusiasm. Incredible, truly incredible. And now to present the Wheeler Global Youth Empowerment Award, please welcome the founder and CEO of Wheeler Global Holdings, Mr. John Wheeler. John stood mechanically. Veronica reached for his arm, concerned or possessive or both, but he moved past her without seeming to see her, walking toward the stage on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else. Every step was a choice. Every second was a moment when he could turn back, could let someone else present the award, could maintain the lie that he was just a philanthropist and she was just a speaker, and there was no connection between them except the transactional relationship of donor and recipient. But he kept walking, onto the stage, into the spotlight, toward his daughter. Up close, she was even more devastating. His eyes, her mother's smile, a combination of both their features rearranged into someone entirely new and entirely familiar. She looked at him with polite expectation, the expression of someone meeting a stranger who held power that might benefit her work. She had no idea. John took the microphone. The award, a crystal sculpture, meaningless and expensive, sat on the podium beside him. The speech Leonard had written was folded in his pocket, full of corporate language about investment in future leaders and commitment to education access. He didn't reach for it. "Ms. Miller," he said, voice rough. The ballroom had quieted again, sensing something off in his demeanor, in the way he was looking at her, not like a CEO to a grant recipient, but like a man confronting a ghost. "You don't know me." Confused pause. Her brow furrowed slightly. "But I know you," John continued, words coming from somewhere beyond preparation, beyond control. "I've watched you tonight. I've listened to your speech, and I've seen—" His voice cracked. "I've seen everything I once threw away." The ballroom was silent now. Veronica had gone rigid in her seat. Candy Sr. had risen to her feet, face stricken. "Your words about single mothers, about people who abandon their responsibilities, about showing up being the real measure of success." John's hands shook on the microphone. "Those words, they're about me. You don't know it, but they're about me." Candy Jr. had taken a step back, confusion turning to alarm. 18 years ago, I walked away from a woman I loved. She was 6 months pregnant. I told myself I was leaving to build a better life for us. The truth is, I was terrified of failing. So I chose ambition over love. I chose potential wealth over present family. I chose everything except the people who needed me. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Cameras that had been casually filming were now focused, alert, capturing the moment when a carefully constructed image began to crack. I never came back. Tears were streaming down John's face now, unmistakable in the spotlights. "I sent money once. She sent it back. And instead of trying again, instead of being the father my daughter deserved, I built this." He gestured at the ballroom, the gala, the empire his name represented. "I built towers and made billions, and convinced myself that success was its own justification." Candy Jr.'s face had gone white. Her mother was pushing through tables, trying to reach the stage. "And tonight," John whispered, looking at his daughter for the first time with honesty instead of the careful neutrality he'd been maintaining, "you stood here and told me exactly who I am. Someone who abandoned responsibility. Someone who found it easier to write checks than to show up. Someone who—" He broke completely. The microphone slipped in his shaking hands. "I'm your father," he said, voice barely audible but carried by speakers throughout the ballroom, broadcast to every corner of the room and likely being live-streamed to whoever was following the gala online. "I'm the person who left your mother, who wasn't there when you were born, who missed every birthday, every milestone, every moment when you needed me." The ballroom exploded. Cameras flashed like lightning. Gasps became shouts. Veronica stood abruptly, her chair scraping across the floor. Journalists who'd been covering the event as human interest story suddenly realized they were witnessing scandal. "I don't deserve your forgiveness," John continued over the chaos. "I don't deserve to stand here, but I'm begging anyway, because you were right, showing up matters. Even when it's 18 years too late, even when—" But Candy Jr. wasn't listening anymore. The crystal award slipped from her nerveless fingers, hitting the stage with a crack that sounded like a gunshot over the speakers. She stood frozen for one terrible moment, face blank with shock, eyes wide and disbelieving, and then ran. Off the stage, through the ballroom, past tables and guests, and her mother who tried to catch her, tried to hold her, but couldn't stop the momentum of a daughter fleeing the truth she'd never been prepared to hear. The last thing the ballroom saw before she disappeared through the doors was her mother's cry echoing across marble floors and beneath chandeliers, a sound of 18 years of pain finally given voice. And John Wheeler stood alone in the spotlight, broken and exposed, watching his daughter run from him for the second time in her life. Except this time, she knew exactly who he was and exactly what he'd done. Rain came like judgment, cold and hard, turning the palace's marble arch into a shelter that leaked at the edges. Candy Jr. stood beneath it, shivering, emerald dress soaked through, mascara running black down her cheeks. phone buzzing with texts from her mother that she couldn't bring herself to read. She'd run, like a child, like someone who wasn't strong enough to face the truth that had just detonated her understanding of who she was. Because if John Wheeler was her father, the billionaire philanthropist, the empire builder, the man whose money had funded her award, then every story her mother had told was a lie. Every deflection about someone who left had been hiding a specific name. Every assurance that you don't need to know had been protection that suddenly felt like betrayal. He'd been there, all along in the same city, building wealth while she'd learned to live without, creating a foundation to empower youth while ignoring the daughter who would have benefited from knowing her father hadn't completely abandoned her, had just been too cowardly to claim her. "You don't get to ruin my life twice." The voice came from behind her. Candy Jr. spun to find John Wheeler standing in the rain, tuxedo soaked, hair plastered to his forehead, looking nothing like the polished CEO and everything like a man who'd lost his last excuse for staying away. "I didn't," he started. "You didn't mean to?" Candy Jr.'s voice shook with rage that had been building for 18 years without knowing who to direct it at. "You didn't think. You didn't realize that confessing in front of cameras and witnesses was maybe something you should have discussed with me privately first." "You're right." John took a step closer, hands spread in surrender or supplication. "You're completely right. I panicked. I stood there listening to you talk about abandonment and showing up, and I couldn't let you leave without knowing." "Knowing what? That my father is a billionaire who decided I wasn't worth his time? That he built an empire instead of being a dad? That everything my mother told me about him not being ready was bullshit? Because he was ready. Ready to be rich, just not ready to be a father?" The words hit like physical blows. John flinched with each one. "I don't expect you to understand," he said quietly. "I don't expect forgiveness. I needed you to know that the person who left wasn't the person I am now." "Who are you now?" Candy Jr. challenged. "Because from where I'm standing, you're still the same person, still choosing what's comfortable over what's right, still making grand gestures instead of doing the actual work. You stood on that stage and confessed because it absolved you, not because it helped me." "That's not—" But John couldn't finish because the accusation was true. His confession had been about his need for absolution, not her need for truth delivered with care. They stood in the rain, father and daughter, stranger and stranger, while traffic hissed past on wet streets and the storm washed the city clean of everything except the guilt that clung like oil. "I left because I was terrified," John said finally, voice barely audible over the rain. "Your mother was pregnant. We had nothing. The deal in Singapore, it was everything, everything I'd worked for. Everything I thought I needed to become to deserve you both. And I convinced myself that leaving temporarily was different than leaving permanently. That I'd come back rich enough to fix everything. How'd that work out for you?" The bitterness in Candy Jr.'s voice was caustic. "It didn't. I got rich, and I stayed gone. Because every month I waited to come back, the gap got wider. The money got bigger, but the distance got further. And eventually, it was easier to believe you were better off without me than to admit I was just a coward who'd let fear win." "You were a coward," Candy Jr. agreed. "But you know what the worst part is? It's not that you left. People leave. I get that. People get scared and make mistakes and aren't ready for the responsibility they have taken on." "Then what's the worst part?" John asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. "The worst part is that you stayed gone." Tears mixed with rain on her face, indistinguishable. "You had 18 years to change your mind. 18 years to say, I made a mistake and I'm coming home. But you didn't. You built buildings. You made billions. You funded scholarships for other people's kids, while yours worked 3 part-time jobs to fund her own education." Each word was an indictment. Each sentence a conviction. "You can't buy forgiveness," Candy Jr. said finally, voice breaking. "You can't stand on a stage and confess and expect applause for finally being honest. Because honesty 18 years late isn't brave. It's just the minimum requirement of being human." "I know," John said, and then, to her surprise, he knelt, right there in the rain, in his expensive tuxedo, on the wet marble that would ruin the fabric. He knelt before his daughter like a supplicant before a judge and looked up at her with a face that had finally abandoned all pretense. I know I can't buy forgiveness. I know confession doesn't equal redemption. I know that showing up 18 years late doesn't make up for not showing up at all. His voice shook. But I'm not trying to buy or earn or justify anything. I'm just, I'm just begging for a chance, not to be forgiven, not to be your father, because I haven't earned that title, just for a chance to start trying, to show up, to be present, to do the work I should have been doing all along. Candy Jr. stared down at him, this powerful man kneeling in the rain, this stranger who shared her DNA, this father who'd been absence instead of presence her entire life, and felt something crack in her chest that wasn't quite forgiveness, but wasn't quite hatred either. It was the space between, the gray area where anger and longing coexisted, where the daughter who'd grown up without wanted to punish the father who hadn't been there. But the person who'd been raised by a mother who taught compassion couldn't quite manage cruelty. You don't get to call yourself my father, she said finally. Not yet, maybe not ever. That's a title you have to earn. I understand. And you don't get to waltz into my life because guilt finally outweighed convenience. I have a life, a mother, work, people who've actually shown up. You don't get to disrupt that because you finally developed a conscience. I wouldn't, but Candy Jr. interrupted, and the word hung between them like a possibility. If you actually mean it, if you're actually willing to do the work, then maybe I'm willing to let you trace. John's eyes closed. Tears mixed with rain, impossible to separate. Thank you. Don't thank me. Thank my mom. She's the one who taught me that everyone deserves a chance to do better, even people who don't deserve second chances. Candy Jr. took a shaky breath. The storm outside is ending, John, but the one inside me, that's just starting. And if you want to be part of my life, you're going to have to weather it. All of it. The anger, the questions, the moments when I hate you for not being there. Are you strong enough for that? John looked up at his daughter, 18 years old, soaked through, stronger than he'd ever been, and answered with the only honest word he had left. I'll try. Morning broke over a scandal. Millionaire discovers secret daughter at charity gala. Wheeler heir revealed in shocking confession. Billionaire's public plea for forgiveness goes viral. The headlines screamed across every news outlet, tabloid, social media platform, blog that had been following the gala's live stream or picked up footage afterward. John Wheeler's confession had been recorded by dozens of cameras, shared by thousands of viewers, dissected by millions of commenters who had opinions about fatherhood and abandonment and whether public redemption was sincere or performative. His phone wouldn't stop ringing. The board demanded emergency meetings. Investors wanted assurance that the scandal wouldn't impact quarterly earnings. PR consultants crafted statements that tried to spin confession into character. Veronica had ended their engagement via text. I don't date men with this much baggage. Good luck with your little reunion. The diamonds she'd returned were worth $100,000. John gave them to charity without a second thought, because he didn't care about the scandal or the board or the investors or the engagement that had been convenience instead of love. He'd spent 18 years caring about those things while ignoring the only thing that actually mattered. And now, driving down the coastal highway toward Port Elizabeth in a car that cost more than the apartment he was about to visit, John felt something he hadn't felt in nearly 2 decades. Terror, not the fear of financial ruin or professional embarrassment, the kind of terror that came from facing someone you'd wronged and having no power, no money, no carefully rehearsed speech that could protect you from their justified anger. Port Elizabeth looked exactly as he remembered. Small, weathered, beautiful in the way that coastal towns are beautiful when you're not desperate to escape them. The pier where he'd proposed, the diner where they'd eaten pancakes and planned futures they'd been too young to deliver on, the motel where they'd lived for 3 months before finding the apartment, the one where he'd last seen Candy pregnant and hopeful and believing his promises. He found her house easily. The address from the background report burned into his memory. A small 2-bedroom with a patched roof and a garden that showed care despite limited resources. Laundry hung on the line, sheets and towels moving gently in the sea breeze. The mundane poetry of a life built from work and love and the determination to create beauty despite hardship. Candy was hanging the last sheet, wooden clothespins in her mouth, reaching to secure the corner when she saw him. She froze. The clothespins fell. For a long moment, they just stared at each other across the small yard that separated them, a distance of 20 feet that felt like the 18-year gap they'd lived on opposite sides of. Time had changed them both, made her stronger, leaner, the softness he remembered replaced by the hardness that survival required, made him polished, wealthy, the rough edges he remembered smoothed by success into something that looked good in boardrooms, but felt hollow in moments like this. Candy, her name on his lips after 18 years of not speaking, it felt like prayer and confession, both. She said nothing, just stood there holding the empty laundry basket, face unreadable, eyes holding every year of hurt and strength, and the complicated emotions of someone seeing the person who destroyed and shaped her in equal measure. I know I don't have the right to be here, John said, staying on his side of the yard, respecting the boundaries she hadn't invited him to cross. I know showing up now doesn't make up for not showing up then. But his voice cracked. I needed to see you, to say I'm sorry, to try to explain. You left me, Candy said, voice flat and terrible. 6 months pregnant. No money, no job, no family who supported me, because they'd warned me you'd leave and I'd defended you. She set the basket down carefully, like controlling its placement was the only thing keeping her composed. You left me to starve, John, to figure out prenatal care and birth and raising a child entirely alone, while you built your empire. I know. The words were inadequate. Everything he could say would be inadequate. Do you? Candy's voice rose. Do you actually know what it was like? Working until my water broke because I couldn't afford to stop? Having our daughter 3 weeks early because stress triggered labor? Spending her first birthday alone because I couldn't afford childcare to go to the party I'd been invited to? Tears streamed down her face now. Do you know what it's like to watch your daughter ask why she doesn't have a daddy and having to decide whether to tell her the truth, that her father decided we weren't worth staying for, or lie and say he died because sometimes dead is easier to accept than abandoned? John couldn't speak, could only stand there taking each word like the blow it was meant to be. I hated you, Candy continued. For so long, I hated you. And then I got tired of hating you because hate takes energy I needed for raising our daughter. So I stopped thinking about you. I built a life from the pieces you shattered. I became the person I needed to be because you weren't the person you promised you'd be. I left because I thought I wasn't enough, John managed, voice raw. I was 23, terrified, broke. I looked at you pregnant and beautiful and believed I'd only drag you down. The deal in Singapore, it was supposed to be temporary. 3 months, 6 at most. Come back rich enough to give you both everything. I didn't want everything. Candy's voice broke. I wanted you. I wanted the man who proposed on the pier, who said vows in a courthouse, who whispered promises to our daughter through my skin. I wanted him to stay even though it was scary, even though it was hard, even though... She covered her face with her hands. John took a step forward, stopped when she flinched. I can't take it back. Can't undo 18 years. Can't give you back the moments I stole by not being there. All I can do is... He didn't know how to finish. What? Candy looked at him through tears. What can you do, John? Send money? Because you tried that and I sent it back. Apologize? You did that publicly last night, so what else is there? I can show up now. The words came out barely audible. I know it's late. I know it doesn't repair the damage. But I can start showing up for her. For... He couldn't say for you because that felt presumptuous, like he had any right to be there for the woman he'd abandoned. Candy stared at him, really looked at him for the first time since he'd arrived. Saw not the empire builder or the billionaire, but the boy she'd loved who'd been too terrified to become a man. The person who'd chosen fear over love and was finally trying to choose differently. You never had to be rich, she said finally, voice quiet now, exhausted. You never had to build an empire or make millions or become someone important. You just had to come back. That's all I needed. Not your money, just you. Coming back. Choosing us. I know. John's voice broke completely. I know, and God, Candy, I'm so sorry. I'm sorry I left. I'm sorry I didn't come back. I'm sorry our daughter grew up thinking abandonment was normal because I normalized it. I'm sorry I let fear make me into the kind of man who builds towers but can't stay home. They stood in silence, sea breeze moving laundry, gulls crying overhead, the ordinary sounds of a life John hadn't been present for. I don't forgive you, Candy said finally. I'm not ready to forgive you. Maybe I'll never be ready. But, she took a shaky breath, our daughter deserves the chance to know her father if he's actually going to try. Not the man who left, but the man who's brave enough to stay even when staying is hard. I'll stay, John promised. I'll show up. I'll do the work. Don't promise, Candy interrupted. Just do, because we've had enough promises for 3 lifetimes. She turned back to her laundry, dismissing him without saying the words. But before John could leave, she spoke again. Thursday nights, 6 p.m., the community center where she volunteers. Be there, help with the kids. Don't show up with money or grand gestures. Just show up consistently, like a father who actually cares more about being present than looking generous. I'll be there. We'll see. Candy didn't turn around. You might be telling the truth this time, John, or you might be a coward playing at courage because guilt finally got too heavy. Either way, she deserves to find out. John left the yard, climbed into his expensive car, and sat for 10 minutes just breathing. The conversation had been brutal. Necessary. The kind of reckoning he'd avoided for 18 years because facing Candy meant facing every lie he'd told himself about leaving being noble. But as he drove away from the coastal town he'd fled 2 decades earlier, John felt something he hadn't expected. Not peace, not forgiveness, but the possibility, small and fragile, that redemption wasn't about grand gestures or public confession or the money he'd spent 18 years accumulating. It was about showing up, consistently, even when it was hard, especially when it was hard. 6 weeks later, a smaller charity event, nothing like the gala, just a local gathering to celebrate the opening of 3 new learning hubs funded by the award money Candy Jr. had earned. The venue was modest, community center instead of ballroom, folding chairs instead of imported seating, paper banners instead of designer decorations. But the room hummed with genuine warmth, people who'd actually benefited from the program instead of donors looking for tax write-offs and positive publicity. Candy Jr. stood at the front preparing her remarks, flanked by 2 people she'd never expected to see on the same stage. Her mother on her left, proud, strong, wearing the strength of 18 years like armor that had finally been allowed to come off. Her father on her right, humbler now, dressed simply, no tuxedo or billionaire performance. Just a man who'd spent 6 weeks showing up to volunteer sessions without cameras or press releases, who'd learned the names of kids nobody famous cared about, who was trying to be useful instead of important. Good evening, Candy Jr. said to the gathering. Thank you for being here. 6 weeks ago, I gave a speech at a fancy gala. It was supposed to be about education access. It turned into something else, a confrontation with truth I hadn't been prepared for. Eyes darted to John. Everyone here knew the story, had seen the viral footage of the confession. I learned that night that my father, the man I'd grown up without, was actually in the room. That his absence wasn't circumstance but choice. That he'd built an empire while I'd built myself. She took a breath. And I was angry. I'm still angry. Probably will be angry for a long time. John stood perfectly still, face neutral, accepting every word. But I was also raised by a woman who taught me something important. People say forgiveness is for the weak. But maybe it's for those strong enough to remember pain and still choose love. Candida turned to her father. You left. You stayed gone. You missed everything important. Those are facts. They don't change because you feel guilty now. They don't disappear because you're trying to do better. I know, John said quietly. But, she took his hand, trembling. But you're here now. You've been here every Thursday for 6 weeks, helping kids with coding, listening to their problems. Not because cameras were watching or because it made you look good, just because I asked you to show up. Tears streamed down John's face, unchecked, unashamed. I don't know if I'll ever call you Dad. That's a title you have to earn. But I can call you John. And maybe that's enough for now. Maybe that's how redemption starts. Not with grand gestures, but with showing up consistently, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. She looked at her mother. His mom taught me that love is action, not words. That being there matters more than being impressive. That the real measure of a person isn't what they promise when it's easy, but what they deliver when it costs them everything. Candy Sr. was crying too, but smiling through the tears. So today we're opening 3 learning hubs, places where kids like me, kids who don't have trust funds or connections or the advantages that wealth provides, can learn and grow and become whoever they're meant to be. Candy Jr. looked between her parents, past and present, pain and possibility, everything that had broken and might be rebuilding. And maybe that's the real lesson. Not that family is perfect, but that family is what you create through showing up, through doing the work, through choosing every day to be present for the people who need you. The crowd applauded, gentle, genuine, moved by words that transcended prepared speech. And on that modest stage in a community center, 3 people who'd been shattered by abandonment stood together, not perfect, not healed, but present. A father trying to earn the title he'd abandoned. A mother who'd built a daughter strong enough to forgive. A daughter learning that redemption wasn't about deserving forgiveness. It was about being brave enough to offer it anyway. The lights dimmed, the crowd rose. And for the first time in 18 years, John Wheeler stood with his family. Broken, imperfect, but finally whole. Not because money had bought him back. Not because confession had absolved him, but because he'd learned what his daughter had tried to teach him that night in the rain. Wealth could build empires, but only presence rebuilt hearts.